October 1950. Zhongnanhai, Beijing, China. The telegram from Stalin arrived in the early hours of the morning, delivered by a nervous courier who understood the weight of the message he carried. Mao Zedong sat in his sparse office in Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound in Beijing, reading the words that would force him to make one of the most consequential decisions of his life. The Americans had crossed the 38th parallel. General Douglas MacArthur's forces, having driven the North Korean army back from its invasion of South Korea, were now pushing north toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, was on the verge of collapse, and Stalin was demanding, that China intervene to save the communist regime in Pyongyang. Mao set down the telegram and lit a cigarette, one of the many he would smoke that day as he wrestled with a decision that could determine the fate of the revolution he had spent his life building. The People's Republic of China was barely a year old. The civil war against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists had only just ended, with Chiang fleeing to Taiwan. China was exhausted, devastated by decades of war, its economy in ruins, its people desperate for peace and stability. And now, Stalin wanted him to go to war with the United States, the most powerful nation on Earth, a country with nuclear weapons and industrial capacity beyond imagination. Mao stood and walked to the window, looking out at the pre-dawned darkness. Beijing was quiet, the city sleeping, unaware that its leaders were contemplating a decision that would send hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers to their deaths in the frozen mountains of Korea. Zhou Enlai entered the room, as he had been summoned to do. Zhou was Mao's premier, his closest advisor, the diplomat and administrator who balanced Mao's revolutionary fervor with pragmatic calculation. He looked tired. They were all tired in those days, exhausted by the demands of building a new nation from the wreckage of the old. "You've read Stalin's message?" Mao asked without turning from the window. "Yes," Zhou replied. "He wants us to send troops to Korea. He says if we don't, the Americans will destroy the North Korean regime and establish a hostile government on our border." Mao turned to face Zhou, his expression unreadable. "And what do you think?" Zhou hesitated. He knew that Mao had already made up his mind. Mao always made up his mind before asking for advice, but he also knew that Mao valued honest counsel even when it contradicted his own views. "I think it's a terrible risk," Zhou said carefully. "We've just ended one war. Our people are exhausted. Our economy is shattered. We need time to rebuild, to consolidate the revolution, to establish ourselves as a nation. If we fight the Americans, we could lose everything we've gained. They have superior weapons, superior technology, superior logistics. They could bomb our cities, destroy our industry, perhaps even use nuclear weapons against us." Mao nodded slowly. "Everything you say is true. And yet, what choice do we have? If the Americans reach the Yalu River, if they establish a hostile regime in North Korea, we will have American troops and American bases on our border. They will support Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, will try to overthrow us, will never allow the revolution to succeed. We will be surrounded by enemies, strangled before we have a chance to grow strong." He walked back to his desk and picked up the telegram again. "Stalin is right about one thing. We cannot allow Korea to fall, not because we care about Kim Il-sung, who is an arrogant fool who brought this war upon himself by invading the South, but because we cannot allow the Americans to believe they can threaten China with impunity. We must show them that we are not afraid, that we will defend our interests, that the era of Western domination of Asia is over." Zhou said quietly, "But at what cost, Chairman? How many Chinese soldiers will die in Korea? How many resources will we divert from rebuilding our own country? And what if we lose? What if the Americans defeat us and use that victory to justify an invasion of China itself?" Mao's eyes flashed with anger. "We will not lose. The Americans may have superior weapons, but we have superior will. We have the people. We have the revolutionary spirit. We have the determination to resist imperialism, no matter what the cost. That is worth more than all their bombs and tanks." He sat down and leaned forward, his voice taking on the pedagogical tone he used when explaining revolutionary theory. "Joe, you must understand, this is not just about Korea. This is about the future of the revolution, not just in China, but throughout the world. If we allow the Americans to crush North Korea, we send a message to all the oppressed peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America that resistance is futile, that American power cannot be challenged, that they must accept their subjugation. But if we fight, if we show that even a poor, backward country like China can stand up to American imperialism, we inspire revolutionary movements everywhere. We prove that the paper tiger can be defeated." Zhou knew better than to argue when Mao spoke in these terms. The chairman had made his decision. China would enter the Korean War. "How many troops?" Zhou asked. "Initially, 250,000, Mao replied, "under the command of Peng Dehuai. We'll call them volunteers to maintain the fiction that this is not a war between China and the United States. But they will be regular army units, our best soldiers, equipped as well as we can manage." He paused, then added, "And we must prepare for a long war. The Americans will not give up easily. They will escalate, will bring more troops, more weapons. We must be ready to match them, to send more soldiers, to accept heavy casualties. This will not be quick or easy, but it is necessary." Zhou nodded reluctantly. "I'll begin making the arrangements, but Chairman, there is one other matter we must discuss. Your son." Mao looked up sharply. "Anying?" "Yes. Mao Anying has volunteered to serve in Korea. He wants to go with the first wave of troops to serve as a translator and liaison officer for General Peng." For the first time that morning, Mao's composure cracked. His eldest son, Anying, was 28 years old, a bright young man who had studied in the Soviet Union and returned to China full of revolutionary enthusiasm. Mao had not been a particularly attentive father. The revolution had always come first, and his children had often been neglected or sent away for their own safety. But he loved his son in his way, and the thought of sending him into combat against the Americans filled him with dread. "No," Mao said immediately. "He cannot go. It's too dangerous." Zhou said gently, "Chairman, if you forbid him from going, people will say that you demand sacrifices from others that you are unwilling to make yourself. They will say that the children of the leadership are privileged, that they don't share the burdens of ordinary soldiers. It will undermine the revolution's legitimacy." Mao stood and began pacing, agitated. "I don't care what people say. He's my son. I've already lost so much. My first wife, my other children. I cannot lose Anying too. But if you prevent him from serving," Zhou pressed, "you will lose something else. The moral authority to ask other fathers to send their sons to die in Korea. How can you tell the people that this war is necessary, that these sacrifices must be made, if you protect your own son from those same sacrifices?" Mao stopped pacing and stood still, his back to Zhou. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I know you're right. I know what I must do. But that doesn't make it any easier. He's my son, Zhou. My son." He turned around, and Zhou was shocked to see tears in Mao's eyes, something he had never seen before, something he would never see again. "I've given everything to the revolution," Mao said quietly. "My youth, my health, my family. I've sacrificed everything for the cause, and now I must sacrifice my son too. Is there no end to what the revolution demands? Is there nothing it will not take from me?" Zhou had no answer. He simply waited as Mao struggled with the decision. Finally, Mao wiped his eyes and straightened his shoulders. "Tell Anying he can go. Tell him I'm proud of him. Tell him to serve the people, to remember what we're fighting for, and tell him to be careful." Zhou bowed slightly. "I will, Chairman." After Zhou left, Mao sat alone in his office, smoking cigarette after cigarette, thinking about his son, about the war, about the impossible choices that leadership demanded. He thought about his own youth, about the early days of the Communist Party, when they had been hunted fugitives hiding in the mountains. He thought about the long march, the brutal retreat that had nearly destroyed them but had forged them into a revolutionary force. He thought about the war against Japan, the civil war against the nationalists, the countless battles and narrow escapes that had brought him to this moment. And he thought about the United States, the great power that now stood in his way, that threatened everything he had built. Mao had always believed that the United States was a paper tiger, seemingly powerful but actually weak, unable to sustain a long struggle against a determined revolutionary movement. He had studied American history, had read about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the isolationist tendencies of American politics. He believed that Americans were soft, unwilling to accept casualties, easily discouraged by setbacks. But he also knew that the Americans had enormous resources, that they had defeated both Germany and Japan, that they possessed weapons of unimaginable destructive power. Fighting them was a gamble, a calculated risk based on his belief that will and determination could overcome material superiority. "They are afraid of us," Mao said aloud to the empty room. "They see the Chinese Revolution and they are terrified that it will spread, that the oppressed peoples of the world will rise up and overthrow their oppressors. That's why they invaded Korea, why they're supporting Chiang in Taiwan, why they're trying to surround us. They know that we represent the future, and they are desperately trying to preserve the past." He stood and walked to a map of Korea that hung on the wall. He traced the American advance with his finger, following the line north toward the Chinese border. "MacArthur thinks he can conquer North Korea, can reach the Yalu River, can threaten China itself. He thinks we are too weak to resist, too exhausted from our own civil war to fight another one. He is wrong. We will fight, we will bleed, we will die if necessary, but we will not submit. We will not allow American imperialism to dominate Asia. The era of Western colonialism is over, and we will prove it in the mountains of Korea." The decision made, Mao turned his attention to the practical details of the intervention. He met with military commanders, discussed strategy and logistics, made plans for the movement of troops and supplies. He sent messages to Stalin, negotiating for Soviet air support and military equipment. He prepared propaganda materials to explain the intervention to the Chinese people, to frame it as a defensive war to protect China from American aggression. And he waited for news from Korea, where the first Chinese volunteers were already crossing the Yalu River under cover of darkness, moving into position to launch a surprise attack on the overextended American forces. The attack came in late October, a massive Chinese offensive that caught the Americans completely off guard. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, moving at night to avoid American air power, surrounded and attacked UN forces in the frozen mountains of North Korea. The Americans, who had expected to be home by Christmas, found themselves fighting for survival against an enemy they had not known was there. Mao received the reports of the initial victories with grim satisfaction. The Americans were retreating, suffering heavy casualties, abandoning their advance toward the Yalu River. The intervention was working. China had shown that it could stand up to the world's most powerful nation. But the cost was already becoming apparent. Chinese casualties were enormous, thousands killed in the first weeks of fighting, many more wounded or suffering from frostbite in the brutal Korean winter. The Chinese soldiers, poorly equipped and supplied, were dying in vast numbers even as they pushed the Americans back. And then, in November, Mao received the news he had been dreading. His son, Mao Anying, had been killed in an American airstrike on the headquarters where he was serving. He was 28 years old. When Zhou Enlai brought him the news, Mao sat in silence for a long time, his face expressionless. Finally, he said, "How did it happen?" "An American bomber attacked the headquarters building," Zhou said quietly. "Several officers were killed. Anying was among them. He died instantly." Mao nodded slowly. And the others? How many other sons have died in Korea? Thousands, Chairman. The casualties have been very heavy. Mao stood and walked to the window again, looking out at Beijing. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, betraying no emotion. Then my son died as they died. In service to the revolution, in defense of China, in the struggle against imperialism. He is not special. He is not more important than any other soldier who has fallen. He gave his life for the cause, as thousands of others have done, as thousands more will do before this war is over. He turned to face Zhou, and his expression was hard, unyielding. We will not make a public announcement about Anying's death. We will not give him special honors or treatment. He was a soldier, and he died like a soldier. That is enough. The revolution does not play favorites, even with the children of its leaders. Zhou said gently, Chairman, you're entitled to grieve. You're entitled to mourn your son. Mao shook his head. I will grieve in my own time, in my own way, but I will not allow personal feelings to interfere with my duty. The war continues. The revolution continues. That is what matters. That is all that matters. He walked back to his desk and picked up the latest reports from Korea. What is the current situation? Are we still advancing? Zhou understood that the conversation about Anying was over, that Mao had compartmentalized his grief and returned to the work of leadership. Yes, Chairman, the Americans are in full retreat. We've recaptured Pyongyang and are pushing south. General Peng believes we can drive them out of Korea entirely if we maintain the pressure. Mao nodded. Good. Tell Peng to continue the offensive. Accept no compromise, no ceasefire, no negotiation until the Americans are driven from Korean soil. We must show them that aggression against the socialist world will not be tolerated, that the Chinese people cannot be intimidated or defeated. Over the following months, the Korean War would settle into a brutal stalemate. The Chinese offensive would push the Americans back, but then American firepower would halt the advance and force the Chinese to retreat. The war would drag on for 3 more years, killing hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers and devastating Korea. Eventually, it would end in an armistice that left the peninsula divided roughly where it had been before the war began. Mao would never publicly acknowledge his son's death, never speak of his personal loss, but those close to him would notice a change, a hardness, a coldness, a willingness to accept enormous human costs in pursuit of revolutionary goals. The man who had wept at the thought of sending his son to war became the man who would later launch the great leap forward in the Cultural Revolution, policies that would cause millions of deaths in pursuit of ideological purity. But on that October day in 1950, when he made the decision to enter the Korean War, Mao Zedong spoke words that would define his approach to the conflict and to the United States for the rest of his life. The Americans think they can intimidate us with their weapons, their technology, their nuclear bombs, he said to his assembled military commanders. They think that because they are rich and powerful, we will submit to their will. They are wrong. We are not afraid of them. We are not afraid of death. We are not afraid of sacrifice. We are the Chinese people, and we have endured for thousands of years. We will endure long after the American empire has fallen. He paused, then continued with fierce conviction. They call themselves the defenders of freedom, but they are the oppressors of the world. They speak of democracy while supporting dictators and tyrants. They claim to want peace while invading other countries and threatening their neighbors. They are hypocrites and imperialists, and we will not bow to them. His voice rose, taking on the revolutionary fervor that had inspired millions of Chinese to follow him. Let the Americans come. Let them bring their bombs and their tanks and their aircraft carriers. We will fight them in the mountains, in the valleys, in the frozen wastes of Korea. We will fight them with courage and determination and revolutionary spirit, and we will show the world that the era of Western domination is over, that the oppressed peoples can resist, that the paper tiger can be defeated. He looked around the room at the generals and officials who would implement his decision. This war will be hard. Many will die, but it is necessary. We cannot allow the Americans to threaten China, cannot allow them to believe they can act with impunity on our borders. We must fight, and we must win, not for ourselves, but for all the oppressed peoples of the world who look to China as an example of what is possible. Then, more quietly, he added words that revealed the personal cost of his decision. I am sending my own son to Korea. He has volunteered to serve, and I have given my permission. If he dies for the revolution, as thousands of other sons will die. I do not ask others to make sacrifices I am unwilling to make myself. The revolution demands everything from all of us, and we must give it willingly. Those words would prove prophetic. Within weeks, Mao Anying would be dead, one of the hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers who would perish in the Korean War. And Mao Zedong, the revolutionary who had sacrificed everything for the cause, his family, his health, his humanity, would continue to lead China for another quarter century, convinced that he had been right to fight the Americans, right to accept the enormous costs, right to believe that will and determination could overcome material superiority. Whether he was right or wrong, whether the Korean War was a necessary defense of Chinese security or a tragic waste of life, historians would debate for decades. But there was no debate about what Mao said when the United States entered the Korean War, when he made the decision that would send hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers to their deaths in the frozen mountains of Korea. "We are not afraid," he had said. "We will fight, and we will show the world that the Chinese people cannot be defeated." It was defiance born of revolutionary conviction, nationalism born of centuries of humiliation by Western powers, and personal determination born of a lifetime spent fighting against impossible odds. And it would shape the course of the Cold War, the relationship between China and the United States, and the fate of the Korean Peninsula for generations to come.